I call the Honourable Sam Lotu-Iiga.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I rise to voice my support for this Returning Offenders Management and Information Bill, sir. And what this bill does, in principle, is to empower corrections to supervise returning offenders. And they, sir, are offenders who will be managed under standard as well as special conditions, consistent with those used to manage offenders who are released from New Zealand prisons. Consistent with those offenders, sir. And as the Minister has already said, this is a regime that is currently not in place. It is a regime that no other government prior to this government has seen to put in place. And, sir, it is about providing conditions to manage the risks of those returning offenders in the interests of public safety and public security. Public safety and public security is the #1 goal here. And we've heard members opposite talk about reintegration, rehabilitation. It's important. But the primary goal is to ensure the public's safety and security from those offenders who are returning. And how does that happen, sir? How does that happen? Well, it happens through regular engagement by probation staff, by agencies, by NGOs who are out there doing the mahi, doing the work currently with offenders who are released from New Zealand prisons. And it's about managing those people and making informed decisions. So this bill sets in place a framework within which we can obtain information from the respective authorities in Australia, and that includes the federal government, but it also includes state governments that oversee the imprisonment of Australian as well as New Zealand citizens who are in state correction facilities, sir. And of course, secondly, it's about conditions that are used to facilitate the rehabilitation and reintegration of offenders. And members opposite have talked about this, but as I've already said, safety first. And also what should be mentioned is that some of these returning offenders, quite a number of them, will be awaiting appeal. So whether or not it is appropriate to impose conditions in terms of rehabilitation and reintegration, when some of these people will actually be returning to Australia, needs to be determined within those conditions. And thirdly, sir, members opposite have talked about rehabilitation and reintegration not being in the primary legislation. Well, it's not appropriate that it be in the primary legislation because the conditions set out to determine the safeguarding and the monitoring and the surveillance of these returned offenders will set out quite clearly on an individual level how those offenders will be managed, sir. And as already been stated, Corrections has been working alongside other agencies, both Justice and Police, all year to prepare for the return of this increased number of offenders from Australia. Corrections has helped manage and supervise these people as is envisaged by the bill, and it's essential that we know who they are, that we know what they've done, that we know some detailed information around their needs, around their risks, and around some of the challenges that will be in place to monitor these offenders once they return to these shores. Sir, and that's why in July, I went to Darwin and I signed a memorandum of cooperation alongside corrections ministers from the various states, because ultimately some of that more detailed information in order to manage some of these offenders is going to be required from the states. And that includes psychological reports, that includes some of the assessments and the risk analysis and the risk assessments that those states do in order to manage those offenders both within those corrections facilities in the states, as well as across the, as well as upon release and the conditions that they are released upon into Australian society. But this agreement, of course, this legislation is not just to manage Australian deported offenders, it's to manage deported offenders wherever they come from right around the world. And we know that there are also risky offenders that come from other countries. And this legislation will capture those people. So in terms of rehabilitation and reintegration, I can say to this House that Corrections are working alongside other agencies. They're working alongside NGOs, for example, like PARS, who do a wonderful job in the community, helping to rehabilitate and reintegrate offenders, where a grant of $100,000 was given to PARS in order to help with the with the reintegration services of returning offenders. Of course, that will not be the only cost. There will be many other costs, and members across this House have noted the costs that will be incurred, not just by corrections, but other agencies, in order to, in the long term, take care of and monitor these offenders. And of course, corrections will work alongside and collaboration with some of these community providers, as well as social service agencies and local government and other government agencies in order to support these offenders adjust to life in New Zealand. And that is in the same way, sir, that corrections will work closely with deported offenders to ensure that they have this support alongside domestic offenders. Sir, this bill has a twofold role. It is about holding offenders to account in terms of their conditions imposed. It is about the safety and security for all New Zealanders. And as a mother of a victim came on the Radio New Zealand this morning, it can have the potential to save lives. It can have the potential to save lives where monitoring of a high-risk offender will lead to a better outcome to avoid the risk and death of New Zealand citizens. Sir, I support this bill. It allows for the fine work to be extended to offenders returning to New Zealand from overseas. It's in keeping with this government's track record of driving legislative change that strengthens our ability to keep the New Zealand public safe first and foremost, as well as reintegrating and rehabilitating these offenders. And that's why, sir, I commend this bill to the House.
Mr. Speaker.